complete solutions for your most complex challenges, comprehensive results that help communities, economies, and natural places thrive. We're the team whose engineering and environmental expertise delivers these outcomes. Around the globe, our engineers, scientists, and technical specialists focus on solving our clients' problems as if they were our own. With BAR's resourcefulness and dedication, you'll find solutions in engineering and design, environmental investigation and remediation, permitting and compliance, sustainability and resiliency, and water management. All our work begins with listening, because your problem deserves a tailored solution from consultants who share your passion and integrity. Because your evolving needs require an agile partner who can dive in and assist at any point along the way. We're here at every step to deliver an exceptional experience, sustainable solutions, peace of mind. Together with BAR, you'll find the best answers to your biggest challenges.
All right, welcome to BAR Engineering's webinar on the Minnesota Industrial Stormwater Multi-Sector General Permit. Today we're going to be talking about a summary of 2025 updates and PFAS requirements. So thank you so much for your time today, and we're so happy you're here with us. So we will be briefly discussing the background and purpose of Minnesota's Industrial Stormwater General Permit and the changes that will take effect in 2025. Most of the presentation will focus on the new PFAS-related requirements and how permittees will need to comply with them. Then we'll wrap up with some suggestions for next steps and allow some time for questions. Before we begin, I would like to go over some logistics. First, if you're having trouble with Teams, please send an email directly to Lisa Unger, our administrative support person. Lisa's email is on the slide, and it's lunger@bar.com. Second, the chat function in Teams is disabled. We will use a link to a form in the chat to submit technical questions or discussion topics, and we'll have the presenters go through them at the end of the session. I encourage you to submit any questions during my colleagues' presentations. We'll accumulate these and address them during about the final 15 minutes of today's presentation. You should already be viewing the presentation slides, and a recording will be sent out for viewing after the webinar. Finally, our contact information will be posted on the last slide, and please feel free to reach out directly to any one of us if you have any questions after our discussion today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers. So my name is Abby Morissette, and I am a senior environmental engineer and vice president based out of our Minneapolis office. My technical specialty is in wastewater and stormwater engineering and compliance, and I work with a wide variety of industrial clients on PFAS and other issues. Aisha Balo is a senior environmental scientist located out of our Duluth, Minnesota office. She specializes in multidisciplinary compliance assistance for industrial clients. Sharon Dahl is a senior environmental scientist located in our Minneapolis office. Her areas of focus are also water and waste permitting and compliance, and she has expertise in laboratory methods and management. Christine Corneli is a senior environmental engineer in our Grand Rapids, Michigan office. Her area of focus is also stormwater and wastewater permitting and compliance, and she is one of our PFAS regulatory tracking leads. Now I will hand it off to Aisha to kick us off with a general overview of the revised 2025 general permit.
Thanks, Abby. All right, let's jump into it. So we're going to start with a very brief overview of the scope of the general permit. Today we're talking about Minnesota's General Industrial Stormwater Permit. So this is a permit that can apply to any industrial facility in the state that has a primary SIC code that's listed in the permit, or any facility that conducts any of the activities covered by the permit in these sectors shown here on the slide. So those facilities have to apply for coverage under this permit or certify for no exposure, which we're going to cover later on. Non-stormwater discharges are generally not authorized, so that would be any water discharged from the site or onto the site that doesn't come directly from rain or snow. So that could be cooling water, processed water, water used to wash buildings or vehicles, etc. Basically anything that doesn't come from rain or snow is generally not covered, with a few exceptions. So facilities that conduct activities that are not authorized under this permit will have to apply for a site-specific permit rather than complying with this general permit. One thing I wanted to point out, the site's stormwater does not necessarily have to discharge off the site to a stream or a water body for this permit to apply. Even if your site captures all the stormwater in a pond, this permit may still apply. The general permit is evaluated and reissued every 5 years, so this particular permit will be in effect until 2030, unless MPCA determines that additional modifications are required before then. So to obtain coverage under the general permit, sites will have to develop a stormwater pollution prevention plan that we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail later, and then submit a complete permit application with the appropriate fee. The only application is using MPCA's e-services website. So the option to have a paper copy is no longer available. And as of today, the e-services application is not yet available to apply for coverage. In fact, it's not available for modifying your current permit coverage or no exposure applications or anything at this time. They're making updates, and MPCA expects that it will be available sometime later this summer. But for now, it's best to just start updating your SWIP and preparing to comply with the new permit so that you're ready to go when the e-services does become available. So coverage under this new permit will not actually begin for your site until you're able to apply online, and then you receive notification from the PCA that they approve your application. So before we talk about the detailed requirements of the permit, I wanted to talk a little bit about the alternative to obtaining coverage under this permit, which is the no exposure exclusion. Facilities that conduct all their industrial activities indoors or have some outdoor activities or materials but can provide a storm-resistant shelter for those activities can obtain the no exposure exclusion and then be exempt from complying with the requirements. But unfortunately, a storm-resistant shelter doesn't necessarily mean just putting a roof over the material or activity. You have to prevent contact from rain or snow. So rain can't blow into the shelter or run into the shelter, contact the material or activity, and then run out. And in addition, the material that's inside the shelter can't have the potential to blow out or spill out. So designing a storm-resistant shelter can be a little tricky. But if you can do that, you can apply for no exposure also in MPCA's e-services application. And that's, again, something that has to be reapplied for every permit term, so every 5 years. And it is actually pretty common for facilities to think that the whole permit in general doesn't apply to them if they don't have any outdoor processes. But I want to reiterate that all facilities with a primary SIC code listed in the permit still have to apply for the no exposure certification, even if they don't have any outdoor processes or materials. And then while it's not explicitly required, we do recommend performing regular outdoor inspections to make sure that your facility continues to be eligible for the no exposure exclusion, because it actually is pretty common for facilities to have violations and for MPCA to issue NOVs to those sites. And when that happens, MPCA will often request sampling of the site's stormwater discharges for any pollutants of concern, which today will probably include PFAS compounds. So if you're going to apply for no exposure, it's really important to maintain compliance. And some of the most common violations are pretty low-hanging fruit. I have them listed on the side here, but it's things like having a dumpster outside with the lid open. That does include scrap metal. Scrap metal has to be stored in a closed leak-proof container or within a storm-resistant shelter to qualify for the no exposure exclusion. Other common violations include trash compactors. Leaking trash compactors is actually pretty common. Dust collectors or bag houses outside that aren't completely enclosed. Deposition from stacks on roofs is another big one. Loading or unloading areas that aren't covered, or transfer activities like fueling stations or fueling up vehicles. Those are some pretty common violations. And I wanted to note that the photo here and most of the photos in the presentation are AI generated. So if you notice that they're just a little bit off, that is why, but I had fun with it. Okay, so just to briefly touch on the general requirements of the permit, if you can't qualify for that no exposure certification. First is the development and implementation of a stormwater pollution prevention plan, or SWIP. That's going to be your main compliance tool that documents how you maintain compliance with the permit, and you have to keep that updated and implemented. And then best management practices, or BMPs, those are the physical or operational controls that the site will use to keep stormwater free from contaminants. And then there are two types of sampling required by the permit. There's the benchmark monitoring, which is required of most sectors in the permit, and exceedances of benchmark limits are not necessarily violations, but they indicate that additional BMPs are needed. And then effluent sampling, which is only required for certain sectors, and exceedances of effluent limits are violations. There's also requirements to conduct regular inspections and submit annual reports. And then each industrial sector will have specific requirements for those particular industries as well. So there's obviously a lot more to it, and I realize I just condensed about 100 pages of permit text into one slide, but the general requirements of the permit didn't change too much from the 2020 version. And for this presentation, we really just want to focus on what's new. So to start out, we're going to go through the changes from the 2020 permit, and I'm going to begin with briefly touching on the changes that aren't PFAS related. So the MPCA does have a nice fact sheet on their website that outlines the changes from the 2020 permit. So again, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail or go through everything for the sake of time, but most of the changes were administrative or clarifying in nature. However, there are a few changes that have kind of practical impacts to permittees, so that's what we're going to highlight on these next few slides. The first is that a formal administrative modification is now required for certain changes. I have them listed here. Previously, some of these were just things that were changes that were made in the SWIP and then noted in the annual report. But the new permit requires a formal administrative modification that's done in e-services. But one thing to note is that the permit doesn't give a time frame for when it has to be submitted, so you can pretty much just assume that it should be submitted in e-services upon the change. Vehicle tracking, the previous version of the permit allowed 72 hours to remove tracked material. Now it has to be removed within 1 day. So that's quite a bit more restrictive. And by the way, this change was not mentioned in NPCA's fact sheet outlining the changes to the permit. So this is one that I think could easily be overlooked. And I think AI actually did a pretty nice job here of showing an example of vehicle tracking that now will be required to be addressed within 1 day of discovery. The management of runoff section was revised. It now requires sites to prevent contact of stormwater with areas on site that have been contaminated by a historical release. And that also includes preventing pollutant mobilization through subsurface soils, or basically contacting a contaminated area on site and then infiltrating. So what this means is if you've ever had a historical release of any pollutant that might still be in the soil, so PFAS, for example, like if you had a firefighting training area and that area of site might still have PFAS in the soil, you will need to take preventative measures to prevent the stormwater from contacting that contamination and infiltrating or running off site. So the BMP maintenance section, there's some new language requiring the development of a maintenance plan for stormwater sedimentation and infiltration basins. And I'm not going to go into the details of the plan today, but one thing to point out is that it specifies that permanent erosion control must be installed at the outlets of all basins. So similar to this photo, at the outlet of your basin, you'll need to have erosion control measures, but at your site, the outlet is probably not magically suspended in the air, unlike this AI photo. Any PFAS containing firefighting foam must be immediately reported to the Minnesota duty officer upon use. This is a requirement that has been in place in Minnesota statutes for a few years now, but now it's officially in the permit. The permit also specifies that spill response plans have to include actions to prevent runoff from firefighting foam usage from entering stormwater. And then there are some changes to the requirements of the SWIP that are mostly administrative in nature. So I'm not going to go into the details here, but definitely make sure to look closely at this portion of the permit when you're updating your SWIP with the new permit requirements. Okay, last slide on general permit changes. First, there are some new changes to what constitutes an exceedance of a benchmark limit. We're going to go into more details on this later on, so I'm not going to talk about it here, but it is an important one, so I didn't want to skip past it here in this summary. And then if you're in a sector that requires effluent monitoring, sampling is now required twice per year instead of annually. And when you go out to take your twice per year effluent samples, make sure you wear gloves and probably put your bottle in the stream of the water, unlike the AI man in this photo. Facilities who discharge to and are within 1 mile of an impaired water body have a lower TSS benchmark limit. This was in the previous version of the permit, but it wasn't very clear that it applied to impaired water bodies as well as outstanding resource value water bodies. And then lastly, there weren't too many changes to sector-specific requirements, but there were some new items added to the 3 sectors listed here. So if you're in sector C, P, or U, you'll want to check out the details in those sector items. And then the requirement to analyze for iron was actually removed for any sector that previously required it. Okay, so moving on to the requirements related to per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, also known as PFAS. So obviously the most significant change from the 2020 permit is the incorporation of the requirements related to PFAS. The PFAS related requirements only apply to facilities with specific primary SIC codes, and those are the ones that are listed in Appendix D of the permit. I also have them shown here on my slide. I want to emphasize that this only applies to your primary SIC code. Many sites have more than one SIC code, so it's important to know which one is the primary code. We did have a question submitted about how to determine the primary SIC code, and I don't have time to go into the specifics, but MPCA does have some detailed guidance around how to determine which SIC code is the primary one. And I have the fact sheet linked here at the bottom of my slide, but it is a self-assigned code, so it's not really something that you can like look up online or anything like that. So the thresholds that trigger corrective actions are shown in the table here, and a few things to point out. Sites that are within 1 mile of a drinking water supply management area, or sites who are within 1 mile and discharged to a Class 1 water body. For those sites, the thresholds are equal to EPA's drinking water criteria. So even though we're measuring stormwater, it's actually the drinking water limits that have been applied to those sites. For all other sites, there's a threshold of 10 nanograms per liter, also known as parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS only. Another thing to point out is that you'll actually be sampling for a whole bunch of other PFAS analytes, but only these specific compounds listed here have thresholds for now. So the first thing you're going to want to do is figure out if your site has a primary SIC code listed in Appendix D, and if it is listed in Appendix D, then figure out if your site is within 1 mile of a Class 1 water or a drinking water supply well. And MPCA does have a search tool that's linked in orange here on this slide. It can help you see where Class 1 water bodies are and where drinking water management areas are, but then you'll still have to determine if your site discharges to those water bodies or those areas. So once you've determined that you do, in fact, need to collect PFAS samples, the first step will be identifying your area of concern and related discharge locations. So the definition of area of concern from the permit is shown here. It basically equates to anywhere on site where you make, use, store, or process PFAS containing materials. Now, several of our clients have read this and interpreted it to mean that if they don't have an area of their site that they think meets this definition, then they don't need to monitor for PFAS. But it's actually been made very clear in MPCA's area of concern guidance document that all facilities have to have at least one area of concern identified. So how do you figure out where your areas of concern are? The first place to look is probably in your safety data sheets. Unfortunately, suppliers weren't required to list PFAS compounds on safety data sheets until recently. However, there are certain keywords that you can look for that might indicate the presence of PFAS, like fluoro or surfactant. You can find a whole other list of keywords that might indicate there's a PFAS compound on your safety data sheet, and there are a few people at BAR who have literally made it an art form to interpret these vague safety data sheets and determine if they're worded in a way that indicates that PFAS might be masked somewhere. But secondly, since PFAS doesn't easily degrade, you'll want to attempt to evaluate the processes that were completed in the past at your facility. And unless you have reason to believe otherwise, you can probably assume that PFAS might have been present in the historical usage of things like adhesives, surfactants, etching fluids, just to name a few. But the most obvious activity that likely contributed to PFAS contamination would be firefighting training locations or areas on site that have previously had a fire. And if you have the type of fire suppression system that's a water tank and then there's a separate foam tank that mixes with the water when it's activated, don't assume that the water is uncontaminated, because we've actually seen several examples of where the seals between the water and the foam have degraded, and then the site has a whole tank of water that they think is just potable water but actually has PFAS. And then if the water lines underground were leaking and weren't taken seriously because it's just water, well, that, as you can imagine, can get really messy. Other areas to consider might be past spill locations, scrap metal storage locations, because hydraulic fluids or anti-corrosion chemicals are known to contain PFAS. That one corner of the site where people used to store random things that don't have a good home, like paints and upholstery, plastic wrapped equipment, refrigerators. All of these things could have had PFAS, so keep an eye out for just those general dump locations. And PCA does have a PFAS desktop screening tool that can be a good place to start, but it can definitely turn into a pretty decent research project. And if you just aren't sure where to start, this might be a good place to engage a consultant. And then you might be asking, well, what do I do if I do all of that research and I still don't find any activities or materials that may contain PFAS? Well, like I said, you do have to identify at least one area of concern. So you might just pick your drainage area with the most industrial activity, or maybe the downspout that collects the largest area of roofs with roof vents if you have a lot of indoor industrial processes. So from there, you'll want to identify the sampling locations for all the areas of concern and come up with a monitoring plan. The sample should be taken where stormwater leaves the area of concern, so that might not necessarily be the same location as your other benchmark or effluent monitoring locations. And the definition of the area of concern doesn't say that the area has to discharge from the site, so you might be sampling from a downspout or an inlet to a basin or something like that. So you're going to basically take all that research that we talked about on the last slide and create a PFAS stormwater monitoring plan, and that will be included with your SWIP. It doesn't have to be submitted. It does have to include a detailed site map, and then that's going to have to be reviewed and updated annually. So it's not a once and done deal. If you learn of new information that indicates a new area of concern should be added, then you might have to restart sampling in the future. MPCA does have a template for the stormwater monitoring plan on their website, but you don't have to use it. And if you have a lot of monitoring locations, or you had to do a lot of research to come up with your areas of concern, I might consider using a different format that's more robust and captures all of the information that you're going to need to be reviewing each year, something that's a little more easier to customize. So now that you know where you're going to sample on site, I'm going to turn it over to Sharon to discuss how to take the samples. And after hearing from Sharon, you might notice a few reasons why the AI man in this photo is not dressed appropriately to take PFAS samples.
Thanks, Aisha. It's great that we have an understanding of the major changes to the permit. Now, we're going to look more in depth as to the laboratories and methods you need to use, what to do and not to do when collecting samples, and the complexity of evaluating the results. To start us off, I want to talk briefly about the evolution of Method 1633. This is the method that is required to be used when reporting PFAS stormwater results. EPA has been working on PFAS methods for many years, looking at ways to test for various PFAS compounds at different types of detection limits and in a variety of matrices. EPA first published a draft version of 1633 in August of 2021. Over the course of the next 2 years, EPA published a total of 4 draft versions of Method 1633. In January of 2024, they finalized Method 1633. Then, in December of 2024, EPA published another version of Method 1633, which is now referred to as 1633A. Any of these versions are acceptable to use according to the general permit. The multi-sector permit states that PFAS testing must be performed by a laboratory approved by the Minnesota Department of Health, MDH, or by MPCA. As of today, 13 laboratories across the country are MDH certified to perform PFAS testing. It is critical that you understand what method your laboratory is approved for and ensure that they analyze your sample by that specific version of 1633. It is possible that if your samples are analyzed by a version of 1633 that the laboratory is not certified for, MPCA may not recognize those results as valid. As you can see in this slide, there are not a lot of local options for testing. Currently, PACE Minneapolis and MVTL in New Ulm are the only laboratories in the state that are certified for Method 1633. But know that there are other laboratories that you can use. Both MDH and MPCA have a query you can use to search for laboratories and to search for which version of the method they are certified for. Just within the past couple of weeks, there's been new laboratories added. The key takeaway here is to always check with the agencies to see if the laboratory that you want to use is certified for Method 1633. This slide compares the similarities and differences of the methods that MDH has approved laboratories for. Consistent across all 4 versions of 1633 is that you must use HDPE bottles with either linerless caps or polypropylene caps. Holding time is either 28 days when stored at 32 to 42.8 degrees Fahrenheit and protected by the light, or 90-day holding time if the samples are stored at less than -4 degrees Fahrenheit, and sheet flow samples are permitted. The main difference between US EPA 1633 Draft 3 versus the other versions of 1633 is that you are only allowed to collect grab samples. Composite sampling is not permitted. Therefore, if you're going to use an existing composite sample location for your PFAS AOC testing location, make sure that the samples are sent to a laboratory approved to use either EPA 1633 Draft 4, the January 2024 version, or 1633A. The main difference of 1633A versus the other method is that this version has slightly lower reporting limits for certain PFAS compounds. The cost of testing should be very similar regardless of what version you are using. Always ask your laboratory for a quote for the testing that you want them to perform, but expect to pay approximately $500 to $750 per sample. When you contract a quote from a laboratory, provide them with information regarding the number of sample locations and specify the required method. Once a contract is in place, the laboratory will send you the associated sample bottles and cooler. Before you take your samples, make sure you have all the necessary bottles, coolers, gloves, and all other equipment, along with an understanding of how the chain of custody must be filled out. Since stormwater sampling is required during or immediately after rainfall or snow melt events, the sample timing can be difficult to predict. Always have a supply of necessary sampling tools and bottles on hand, and make sure that the cooler is not being stored in a location that may cause contamination. If you are going to decontaminate sampling equipment, the lab can also supply PFAS-free water. The lab should also send you additional bottles for QA/QC samples. We'll talk about these types of samples later on, but you should make sure the laboratory supplies a field blank sample that contains analyte-free water. You will need to transfer that water to a sample bottle to expose the lab supply water to the environmental conditions for each sampling location. Turning to PFAS sampling requirements from the permit, you must begin sampling the first full calendar quarter following your facility's coverage issue date. For example, if you establish coverage by the permit in the third quarter of 2025, you must begin sampling in the fourth quarter of 2025. You must sample for 4 quarters. If you sample more than once per quarter, the results must be averaged for that quarter. If you cannot sample a quarter due to a lack of rain or snowmelt, you must justify why a sample was not collected. Sampling must occur within the first 30 minutes of a measurable runoff event that reaches an AOC monitoring location. Now, if you're collecting during a snow sampling event, there must be at least 3 inches of snow that occurred over a period of 3 weeks, and you cannot sample immediately after a snowfall event. In addition, you must take a picture of the sampling area if you are collecting a sample during a snow sampling event. PFAS sampling must be conducted by a responsible individual. According to the MPCA, a responsible individual means an individual or individuals a permittee assigns the task of completing its facility's PFAS monitoring requirements. The individuals may be employed at the facility, for example, an EH&S manager, and/or individuals contracted by the permittee, for example, consultant, individuals from an accredited laboratory, and so forth. The individuals must be knowledgeable with PFAS monitoring and the EPA Method 1633. To become knowledgeable, those individuals shall study PFAS monitoring guidance and review Method 1633. Make sure you record and retain the training and documentation that the responsible individuals have reviewed. Now, when taking samples, there are a lot of items that you may typically use that could cause PFAS contamination. Because of the very low reporting limits, special handling and care must be taken when collecting samples for PFAS analysis to avoid sample contamination. As an example, you should stay away from items such as anything waterproof, anything Teflon, and all Tyvek material. It is recommended that you verify all of the materials that you are using to ensure that they do not contain any PFAS-related components and only bring to the site the necessary equipment that you need and nothing more. Look for products that are explicitly labeled PFAS-free or PFC-free. Also, it is important to avoid wearing any cosmetic or personal care products that could contaminate your sample, and never wear new or unwashed clothing. This is another thing that makes it tricky to plan ahead for sampling grain events. Do not bring any food to the site, since food packaging is a common source of PFAS contamination, and make sure running vehicles are not nearby the sample location, if at all possible. Take care and precaution to ensure that your equipment and materials used for sampling are screened for PFAS contaminants or decontaminate prior to use. This includes pumps, tubing, personal protective equipment, water used for decontamination, as well as sample containers. Work with your sampling partners to ensure that you are using PFAS-free equipment. We also suggest using single-source materials to the extent possible. If you are collecting samples for PFAS testing along with other parameters, collect the sample to be used for PFAS testing first. This will minimize the potential of cross-contamination from other sampling equipment. Use special precautions when collecting PFAS sample, including where you place the bottle cap as you collect the PFAS sample. Use new powder-free nitrile gloves at each sampling location and place the PFAS bottles into individual sealed plastic bags. When you package the samples for shipment, ensure that you are using sufficient amount of ice to maintain the temperature of 32 to 42.8 degrees Fahrenheit throughout your shipment. There are several good videos for how to collect samples. MPCA has videos on how to collect a grab sample, a sheet flow sample. They have specific guidance for PFAS sampling, as well as collecting for PFAS samples from snow. There are also many other videos out there on things to consider when sampling for PFAS samples. Tools are out there to help you comply with sample collection. However, if you are uncomfortable with sampling or want additional help, it might be a good idea to use a consultant to train you in sample collection. When it comes to quality control samples, there's a lot to understand. There are a number of different blanks that each must be analyzed according to Method 1633. Each type of blank will provide you with information as to where possible contamination may have originated from. Field duplicates and matrix duplicates measure the precision associated with sample homogeneity, collection, preservation, storage, as well as laboratory procedures. While not required per the methods, project specifications may require them. Ongoing precision and recovery samples will evaluate if there's some type of interference present during the laboratory preparation that could contribute to a high or low bias in the result. The laboratory should flag any of the quality control samples if they are outside limits, but will typically not describe the impact on the sample results. Now you have PFAS stormwater data. However, the work that you need to do, which is based upon these results, is just beginning. Next, Christine will discuss the next steps for what to do when your PFAS results are over the threshold limits. Christine?
Thanks, Sharon. As you saw, there's a lot of considerations when collecting PFAS samples. I'm planning to talk a little bit now about what to do with the samples you receive, and it'll become clear why you needed to be so careful collecting these samples. Aisha already showed this table of thresholds, but I wanted to put it on this slide as well while we're talking about reviewing your results. So the general permit requires that you collect and average the 4 quarters of sampling results. If some of these results are less than the method detection limits, there's some special considerations you need to make. If your result, shown as X here on the slide, is less than the method detection limit, you'll use 0 as the value when you're calculating your average. But if the result is between the method detection limit and the quantifiable level, you'll use half the quantifiable level to calculate that average. Since collecting PFAS samples is relatively new and we're not totally sure what to expect in samples, it's important to sample early in the quarter. Then if there's a problem with the sample, problem with the analytical, or a result is not favorable, there's time to collect another sample in that quarter, and then all samples collected in the 1 quarter are averaged together as that quarter's sample. I did want to note that if one sample is greater than 4 times one of the thresholds, this is considered an exceedance and triggers more action. And this is not just for PFAS. This is a new requirement for all parameters. So anything you collect, if it's greater than 4 times the threshold, that's considered an exceedance in that one sample. One thing I get asked quite a bit is whether there's a substitute parameter that can be analyzed to screen for PFAS ahead of time, something faster and cheaper to kind of give a heads up on what's going on with your PFAS. While there are some parameters being explored for this and used sort of on a larger scale for screening, there aren't any great substitutes right now at the levels that we're considering against these thresholds. So hopefully to come. So once you have your 4 quarters averaged and are comparing to the thresholds of the 10 or 4 PPT, depending on your area, if you exceed that threshold, that is considered an exceedance, but it is not a violation of your permit per se. It does just trigger additional action. In this case, that is the PFAS Source and Exposure Reduction Plan, or SERP. MPCA has developed a template for this Source and Exposure Reduction Plan. And I wanted to note that this is not a suggested template, but sort of a thou shall use this template. Aisha talked about the monitoring template as suggested or an option of what to use, but in this case, you have to use MPCA's SERP template. And this plan needs to be developed and implemented within 180 days of the quarter when you exceeded the thresholds. MPCA has noted that they'll probably be updating the template quite often as results come in and as changes need to be made. So if you do need to develop a SERP, make sure you're using the most recent version that's posted on the website. The first part of the SERP is just general facility information, contact information, SIC codes, that sort of thing. The next part is PFAS identification, which is really a big step in the plan. It's making a list of PFAS containing products or materials that are used or processed or stored in the facility. How are they used, when, where, and how might they be exposed to the environment? This is also the part where you will discuss whether any fires have been fought or practiced being fought using aqueous film forming foam, AFFF, which contains PFAS. The next section is the PFAS stormwater monitoring results. This is taking a look at your areas of concern, giving a description of that area, why you selected this as one of your monitoring areas, what results have you gathered from that location, photos of the location, pretty much everything about that spot. Finally, the SERP has you discuss your PFAS reducing efforts. This would include removal, replacement, cleaning of any materials, products, processes, vents, tanks, valves, ducts, trying to find those sources you identified in the PFAS identification part and figuring out how to reduce or eliminate them. This section also includes a discussion of an evaluation of your BMPs and their effectiveness. The SERP needs to be reviewed and updated annually to add in any additional information you may have learned or new practices you've implemented. And it will go in with the annual report each year. If it's the first year and you're still developing the SERP, a draft and an update need to go in with the annual report. While the general permit does not require treatment of stormwater for PFAS, we thought it might be good just to spend a few minutes to talk about treatment considerations. The SERP is really the first line of defense in source control, identifying where PFAS may be coming from in your facility, and some initial measures to clean this up or prevent exposure to the environment. Might also take another look at your entire catchment and whether pavement resurfacing or some of your runoff may be contributing PFAS to the environment. So say you have done all of this evaluation of your sources and still exceeding those thresholds in your samples. Now it might be time to dig a little deeper into those areas of concern. The conventional BMPs are not necessarily always effective. PFAS has some special characteristics, such as the way it moves through soil. Some PFAS, and there are many, absorb to soil, so they would be contained, while others move right through the soils. This can make sediment control and infiltration challenging since they are all behaving differently. Okay, so say you need to move on to considering treatment. Some of the most common water treatment technologies for PFAS are separation and destruction. Separation would include things such as granular activated carbon, ion exchange, reverse osmosis to remove PFAS from your water or solids with the result of less PFAS in the effluent. But this also has resulting residuals that will need to be dealt with as well with further treatment or disposal. Destruction often uses high temperatures or thermal oxidation, that sort of thing, to destroy PFAS from the sample. An example of a treatment strategy is stormwater capture and treatment. However, this can be a bit challenging if there are really large storm events due to storage capacity. But let's say you have capacity to capture all the water from a storm. This can then be pumped through a treatment system like granular activated carbon, with the result being discharging the cleaned up water. I just want to say just again here that the general permit is not requiring that you do treatment at this time. We just wanted to touch on it briefly in case your results warrant some further action. With that, I am going to pass it back to Abby to talk a little bit about next steps and how BAR might be able to help with implementation of the general permit. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Aisha, Sharon, and Christine. If these new requirements seem overwhelming, never fear. We are here to help you navigate these waters. So these are some of the ways the BAR team can help you implement and ultimately comply with the revised general permit. We can work with you to evaluate requirements for your facility, develop permit application materials, write pollution prevention and sampling plans, evaluate sampling results, and ultimately, if needed, talk about ways to manage any PFAS that's discovered and design treatment systems. As I said at the beginning, all of the presenters' contact information will be provided at the end of this webinar, so please feel free to reach out to any of us to discuss your specific needs or concerns. So I've been keeping track and questions have been rolling in. I want to make sure that we have time for as many as possible. So we'll head over to the Q&A portion of the webinar here. As a reminder, please submit questions via the Q&A form in the chat, and I will get them to our presenters. Again, thank you so much for your time and look forward to having some more discussion in the next few minutes here. Thanks, everyone. All right, so first question is for Christine. So question is, would any sort of retention pond be considered a sedimentation basin, would any sort of retention pond be considered a sedimentation basin or infiltration basin and require a maintenance plan, even if the pond is not specifically designed as a treatment basin? Christine, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I would say that if this pond is identified in your SWIP as a BMP to reduce or control runoff, then you would need to come up with a maintenance plan for that, or you may already have one if that's the case. But if it isn't used in that way and your SWIP is not calling it out as a specific BMP, then you may just want to note in the SWIP that it's not a BMP, it's just this other part of your facility. If you do want to try and use it as a BMP, make sure to follow your sector requirements because some sectors have specific requirements on details on how treatment basins need to be designed. Hopefully that answers your question.
Awesome. Yeah, and if that isn't an answer to the question to the asker, certainly would love to follow up. Next question is for Aisha. If you have existing coverage through an NPDES permit in Minnesota, do you need to reapply for coverage under Minnesota's new general permit?
Yeah, so I think this person is asking about if you need coverage under the general permit, if you already have an individual NPDES permit. And I think the answer is it depends, unfortunately. If you have a site-specific or an individual permit that already incorporates the stormwater requirements at like all the areas of your site, then you wouldn't have to apply for coverage under this general permit. But if you have portions of your site that aren't covered by an existing individual permit, or if your other permit is only for wastewater or processed water discharges, then you would probably need to apply for this general permit if you have the SIC code that's covered in this permit.
Thanks, Aisha. Christine, when averaging quarterly PFAS results, are all PFAS compounds averaged independently across each quarter, or are they added as a cumulative total for each quarter and then averaged? So individual PFAS or total PFAS?
Right. So the thresholds that are in the general permit are just for PFOA and PFOS. So in each quarter, you will just average, say, all the results for PFOS will be averaged into one PFOS result. Same for PFOA. So you don't need to combine all of the PFAS together. Just PFOA on its own and PFOS on its own.
Yeah, so individual parameter averages, not total PFAS. So have another question. We'll give this one to Aisha. So for industrial locations that are pulled into the sampling requirements under this general permit, only because of the SIC code, without any known PFAS used or identified on site, is there an exit strategy or an off-ramp after a certain number of samples, since there isn't a continued risk?
So unfortunately, the off-ramp is based on the actual sample results and not necessarily the activities that are currently performed on your site. So you won't really know if there's an off-ramp until after you take your 4 quarters, you see what your results are. And if you're above those thresholds, then you'll have to look at next steps for how to reduce the PFAS in your outfall, even if you don't think it's coming from your specific process. Unfortunately, you'll have to come up with some reduction plans. Might include, like Christine said, maybe the worst case would include treating the stormwater. Before there's an off ramp, you have to get below those thresholds.
Thanks. Aisha, I'll give you the next question too. So the general permit was issued in June 2025. Is the first test quarter for benchmark monitoring then July, August, September?
So the sampling starts the first full quarter after you receive coverage. And so since e-services isn't available yet for you to apply to receive coverage, so they said sometime in the summer. So assuming comes online sometime in July, August, or September, then your first set of samples would be Q4, so October, November, or December. And then there was a new question. Sorry, Abby, I just saw it came in about when NPCA thinks that the online application is going to be available. And I just mentioned they said they anticipate this summer, but I put that in quotes because there's been no kind of hard deadline or anything set. And even if there was, it may be pushed back.
Yeah, I've heard from a few people taking bets on when it'll come out. It's a
Yeah.
Then there was another question for soils that are contaminated with PFAS, is there a natural background level that can be determined based on known groundwater impacts, negating within a potential SEA? I'll kick it. If any of our presenters have a specific answer off the top of their head, happy to talk about it. But background level determination is a really tricky concept within PCA. I think that would be a pretty site specific and a pretty niche discussion. I don't know that the permit will have a lot of specifics on situations where there's existing natural background or contamination.
I agree.
In general, when I've talked to PCA about background conditions before, the bar for saying that something is a natural background is pretty high. So I would imagine that they would not interpret any PFAS contamination as being natural. It would be man-made contamination or background. Any of our other presenters have other thoughts on that?
I agree. It's going to be very, very site specific in those types of situations.
Okay, I don't see. Oh, there's one other new question that just came in, and so we'll do this last question, and then we'll wrap up here. So it's, since MPCA's e-services system doesn't allow currently covered permittees to apply, do current permittees need to comply with conditions of the 2025 permit despite not having coverage? Or is coverage and compliance with the new permit not applicable until you can access e-services and formally get coverage? I think our interpretation and what we've been hearing from PCA is that you would continue to comply with the 2020 permit until you formally have coverage under 2025. So it's definitely not too early to start doing things like preparing your SWIP and thinking about what your sampling plan might look like, or starting to define your areas of concern. But no, the requirements wouldn't kick in until folks formally have coverage. I was seeing Aisha and Sharon nod that I'm not off base there. So, all right. So with 1 minute left, should we move to wrap up here? So thank you all so much for your time today. As I said at the beginning, a recording of the webinar and the slides will be shared with anybody who is registered, and all of our contact information is up here. We would absolutely love to hear from you with any questions or any site-specific things that we can help you out with. So I look forward to potentially hearing from you soon. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.